We'll get started in just a minute. It looks like we have a few more people coming in. My name is Wayne Bradshaw. I'm the Policy Director for the Utah League of Cities and Towns. I'd like to welcome everyone today to the Wednesday webinar. We have a great panel ahead for you to talk about some of the changes during the legislative session regarding infrastructure and economic development. And so we'll turn it over to them shortly, but just really quickly, some housekeeping. For anyone that would like to ask a question, if you could do that in the chat box, and please include it to the panelists and all attendees, so those that are attending can see the question that you're asking. We will get to questions as time allows. And one other item before I turn it over, just want to do a quick review of the American Rescue Plan. Here's what we know. So far, the Treasury has 60 days after the passage of the bill to distribute funds to the state and the larger communities within the state of Utah. We anticipate that those funds and the additional guidance will come around May 10th or a little after that. Then for everyone else that does not receive direct allocation from the Treasury, those funds will be available from the state of Utah within 30 days of them receiving them. As a small caveat, the state can ask for 2 additional 30-day extensions. So the funds may be available anywhere from June 9th to August 8th. As more information becomes available about distribution, we will certainly let you know. We know the funds can be used for similar economic revitalization and residential assistance programs that you set up under the CARES funding. You can use these funds for lost revenue, hazard pay, and then additional water, sewer, and broadband. We do have a one-pager available. We sent it out in our Friday fax last week, and we will send the one-pager as well as a one-pager that the governor's office produced in this coming Friday fax. So watch for those documents. And again, we'll have more information as it becomes available from the Treasury and from the governor's office. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andrew Gruber with WFRC and his team to kick it off.
Well, thank you very much, Wayne, and to the whole team at the League of Cities and Towns, and to all of our friends and colleagues out there. Great to see you, or not see you, as the case may be, but I see that there's a lot of our friends and partners that are attending today. Wayne is talking about not the subject of our conversation today. He's talking initially about all the activity in Washington, and my gosh, $1.9 trillion in the American Rescue Plan. I know that our topic today of infrastructure, there's limited ability to use those funds directly for certain types of infrastructure, sewer, water, broadband. Whether those funds will enable you as communities to move your own funds around within your budgets to prioritize other things such as transportation, which is one of the topics we'll talk about today, remains to be seen. We're waiting on Treasury guidance to tell all of us all the rules for how those funds can be used. Some of you in breaking news may also have seen that just today, President Biden is announcing the first component of his $3 trillion American Jobs Plan. He's announcing in Pittsburgh this afternoon $2 trillion in infrastructure investment to be paid for through increases in corporate taxation over an 8-year period. So much happening. We don't really know where that's all going to shake out on that American Jobs Plan, but stay tuned. Today's discussion, of course, is focused here on Utah and the actions taken by the legislature in the recently concluded legislative session. And I'm going to focus on 2 pieces of legislation: House Bill 433 on infrastructure funding and Senate Bill 217, housing and transit reinvestment zones. Now, before I jump in, I do want to introduce you all to a new member of the WFRC team. Miranda Jones-Cox is our new government affairs manager. She comes from GOMB, now GOPB, and so you'll all be seeing a lot more of her as time goes on. Now, the 2 bills I'm going to talk about, as I said, and I will show you this. As I said, the two bills we'll talk about, give me a thumbs up if you can see the presentation, please. Somebody? Yes. Okay, there you go. Infrastructure funding and housing and transit reinvestment zones. Now, the thing that is common in these bills is that both of them, and then also the ones that Nick is going to talk about a little bit later, Nick from Sandy City, is that they both are aimed at the rapid growth that Utah is facing, right? Over the past 10 years, Utah has been the fastest growing state in the nation. And what do? That creates pressures on our infrastructure, on transportation. Of course, it creates pressures on our housing, as our housing prices have appreciated so fast. And that was the topic of the great information that Angela and Wilf presented at the last League webinar. Well, we'll talk here about transportation to start. So House Bill 433, sponsored by Representative Mike Schultz and Senator Cullimore, was designed and in fact was a historic investment in infrastructure in our state. The place to start, though, in thinking about this bill for us as local governments and representatives and partners of local governments is, what are the principles that we adhere to when it comes to investments in infrastructure? Before the session started, we all came together. And when I say we all, I mean Wasatch Front Regional Council and the other metropolitan planning organizations in Utah, along with the Utah League of Cities and Towns and the Utah Association of Counties, to develop a statement of joint principles for state infrastructure investment. And you can see them on your screen here. And I'm very happy to note to you that what the legislature did, the actions that they took, really closely adhered to those principles. So first, principle was invest in infrastructure. The bill authorized an additional $1.1 billion in infrastructure investment, which is on top of the already significant investment the state is making in transportation. Second, support multimodal transportation choices. The bill provides an unprecedented amount of funding toward transit and active transportation, state funding for those modes of transportation, in addition to state road funding. The third principle that we had was to utilize the professional planning and prioritization processes. And I'm happy to say again that the bill focused its investment, be it through an earmark of general funds or be it through supporting the ongoing processes of the state, by utilizing and funding projects that are from Utah's Unified Transportation Plan and prioritized by the State Transportation Commission. And then finally, and I should note, the reason that's really important for all of us is because those are the transparent processes that we use together. Local governments, through the metropolitan planning organizations, we work together to develop those plans and programs and identify the most important projects for your communities. And then finally, being fiscally prudent, balancing current infrastructure investment needs with long-term fiscal sustainability. And as I think everybody knows, the bill actually did do a mix of one-time cash funding out of the surplus, over $700 million in one-time general funds to infrastructure, coupled with the authorization of an amount of bonding that was much more modest ultimately than what was initially proposed. All right, so let's hit on a few of these components. Transit projects, over $300 million in state funding for transit. Most that you've heard about is the double tracking for Frontrunner. This is $300 million in investment for strategic double tracking and upgrading of stations and purchase of new rail cars to make the Frontrunner, which is that spine of our regional transit system, operate more efficiently, faster, more reliably, so it can be a better service. And we'll get into what this means for development when we get to the next bill, Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zones, which capitalizes on that Frontrunner investment. And then you can see other important transit projects that are listed here on the slide. I won't go through all of them. I will note at the bottom, there's also an annual $20 million a year fund coming out of existing transportation dollars to make investments in the Cottonwood Canyons. There's been some confusion about this in that the projects have not been selected yet. UDOT is running the environmental impact statement process. Those funds will build up over time to be utilized once the final projects are determined. Secondly, active transportation. Unprecedented, again, we say that word a lot, but it's true for this bill. Unprecedented investment, $35 million in one-time state funds going for active transportation. What do I mean? Biking projects, essentially. And I'm not talking about recreational projects. I'm talking about projects for commuting within our communities, paved pedestrian or paved non-motorized transportation projects, again, for projects that go through the process coming out of the Utah Unified Transportation Plan. And then reducing the local match, so your communities, as you're seeking funding for projects, rather than a 40% match for those funds, a 20% match, making it easier for you to come up with that local match. And we can help you with that through some of our funding programs as well. Finally, roads, state roads, $705 million in one-time funds, again, general funds going into the Transportation Investment Fund through UDOT for construction projects for state roads. $28 million as a pass-through for certain local projects. You can see the list on the screen in front of you. These, again, are projects that were in the bill, specifically called out in the bill as investments to be made. But again, importantly, they arise out of the Unified Transportation Plan. I'm not going to go over all of these. We have information in the summary. I should have mentioned this before. We did a detailed summary of House Bill 433, which has information on all of this, which Miranda has dropped into the chat. So if you want to dig into more details, you certainly can. But these are projects for one-time funding projects. In addition to that, what the bill did not do was authorize additional bonding for state roads. Originally, the bill was going to be $2.4 billion, a lot of bonding, and it was cut back to $1.1 billion. And you might think, oh, well, that means that the state's not investing as much in transportation as it had planned to. Not so, because what the bill said is to UDOT and the Transportation Commission, you should add years to the programming process. As you're telling the state what investments you're going to make in state roads through it's called programming, where they actually say, here are dollars that are going to be available, and we're going to use them on these specific projects. Extend that time horizon out to 2029, 2030. And that's what the State Transportation Commission is now going through the process of doing. So with over $700 million in state funds that comes annually into the TIF, the Transportation Investment Fund, and the influx of this one-time funding, we have total programming dollars being spent on state roads between now and 2029, 2030 of in the range of $4 billion. Very significant investment, commensurate with the growth that we have in Utah. Now, the selection, again, what projects would be selected? Well, again, it comes from out of the planning and prioritization processes that I described already. There's a lot more information about that through UDOT, and we can answer questions about that if you'd like. But these have not been formally selected yet, but the potential projects for prioritization and programming are the ones listed on your screen there. Significant improvements, for example, to Bangerter interchanges, enhancements and expansion of I-15 in Davis County, and then really projects all over the state. So the way to think about this is the combination of those two lists of projects, the ones that were specified in HB 433, and then the projects to be programmed by the State Transportation Commission. So all in all, significant investment in infrastructure, in transportation across all the modes of transportation, road, transit, active transportation, as well as utilizing the processes that we have all worked on over the years, a balanced approach and a significant positive developments. Wayne, I'm gonna pause there before moving on to SB 217. And I wanna see if there are any questions. And I'm looking at the list of questions. For one thing, yes, GOMB, Governor's Office of Management and Budget, is changing to Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. HB 368 did that. Providing the, we'll provide all of this data, all the slides, and the summary that we put into the chat has all of this information in it as well. Okay. If there's no other questions, we're going to move on to SB 217. With my final comment on transportation infrastructure, stay tuned. We'll see what comes out of the federal government in providing additional resources. And we at WFRC and the League will be sure to share information about that with you as soon as we can. I'm seeing that my name is popping up on here 3 times. Are you seeing that? That's weird. Like I'm in this meeting 3 times, at least it looks like on my screen. I'm proliferating. That's peculiar. Okay, but I'm just going to keep going. That's fine. Okay, the next bill, Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone Act. Okay, this is Senator Wayne Harper and Representative Steve Handy. This bill, its primary objective is that it creates a new development tool, HTRZ, Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zones, to help address Utah's housing crisis by facilitating mixed use, multifamily, and affordable housing development within a 1/3 mile radius of UTA frontrunner stations. Okay, now there are 15 now, soon to be 16, with the Vineyard Station being built, frontrunner stations between Ogden and Provo. And this bill links directly to HB 433 in that the state is doing this unprecedented investment, right, in frontrunner to enhance the capacity of frontrunner, enhance its frequency, longer hours, faster service, et cetera. Well, what this companion bill does is that it recognizes that the areas around those frontrunner stations are terrific locations for us to absorb more of that growth that Utah is experiencing. An area around a frontrunner station is just primed in your communities to have more of that mixed use and multifamily development, if that's what makes sense in your community. And this is not a mandate for this to happen. It is a tool for it to happen to help address some of that housing pressure. In a little more detail, what are the objectives? Well, higher utilization of public transit, increased affordability and availability of housing, conservation of water resources through efficient land use, right? More smaller lots or multifamily development is using less water per capita and per household. Improved air quality by reducing fuel consumption and vehicle trips if it's easier, more feasible for people to live close to frontrunner and use that to get around. Maybe they don't take as many car trips. Maybe they don't even own as many cars. That works for some people. Mixed use development, strategic land use, and then of course, increasing access to employment and educational opportunities. Development in conjunction with the transportation system means that people have a better ability to access opportunities for jobs, for education, et cetera. Those are the overall objectives of the bill. And I'm going to note again that we have a 1-pager that provides more detail on this bill, including a map to the frontrunner stations and the 1/3 mile radius around them. Miranda dropped the link to that summary into the chat as well. Okay, how does an HTRZ get set up? A few elements of the process. I'm going to walk through this, and then I'm very fortunate to have Nick Dirksen with us, who, as you all may know, is the Sandy City Economic Development and RDA Director. He was involved in putting this bill together. I'd also want to note that Benj Becker from Zions Bank Public Finance, and a particular shout out to Rob Jolly with RRJ Consulting, who did a lot of the work behind the scenes to help pull this together, negotiating with stakeholders to come to fruition on this. But Nick's going to help with any of the tough questions on this one. Okay, how do you set up an HTRZ? 3 basic steps. The city makes a proposal, okay? So this is a tool for you. An HTRZ will not be created unless you want it to be created, you and the city, and it is at your initiative to create it. You put a proposal together and it goes to GOED, and then GOED contracts for an independent financial gap analysis. And then based on the findings of that, takes it to a committee that will be set up for each HTRZ. And then that committee has to review and approve. That's the basic 3-step process. Now let's explain that a little more. The city proposal, okay? Again, the city can propose development and zoning. You got to do the zoning first in the area around a front runner station within an area that is 1/3 of a mile radius around the front runner station with up to a maximum of 125 acres. So you have to, it doesn't have to be that much, but you have to figure out which areas in your community around the front runner station make sense for utilizing this tool. The proposed development has to be mixed use, has to have an average, okay, so not just residential, commercial, retail, employment, open space, a mix of uses. Not necessarily all of those, but more than one. It has to average at least 50 housing units to the acre. So that's pretty significant rate of density for you by Utah standards, right? So we're talking about doing it. That's why it's focused only around the front runner stations, the highest capacity transit service. And then at least 10% of the housing units have to be affordable. And in this case, that's above 80% of AMI, average median income. Now, the approach here is what we call an all hands on deck approach. So the city brings the proposal forward, and ultimately, if it's approved, it enables up to 80% of the incremental local property tax revenue growth from not just cities, but counties and school districts and other taxing entities to be captured over a period of time. Now, what I want to note here importantly is, unlike a CRA, in this case, if the city brings the proposal forward, meets all the requirements, and gets approval from the committee, there is automatic tax increment participation by the county and the school district and the other taxing entities. Okay. Now, you can capture that money as needed. And when I say as needed, that's only as needed to cover the additional costs that come from this more intense, more dense development. And we'll get into the financial gap analysis in a moment. But as needed to support the costs of that additional development. So think additional costs associated with affordable housing, writing down the cost of affordable housing, structured parking, so that rather than having around a front runner station a sea of asphalt, you have structured parking, leaving more space for a residential or open space or layers of office on top of structured parking, construction, vertical and horizontal construction costs, and land purchase. These are the eligible costs. And I also want to note that this tool, the HTRZ, can't be used on a parcel where there is already an existing CRA. So there's details that you as a city would have to work through exactly which parcels you would be contemplating for use of an HTRZ. Okay, second step and third step. The second step, the city puts the proposal together and submits it to GOED. GOED then contracts for an independent financial analysis. Now, one of the things that financial analysis does is it evaluates and verifies the amount of public financing and tax increment capture that's needed for the proposed development. So if Nick in Sandy City proposes, along with the rest of the folks in Sandy City, an HTRZ around their front runner station, then that proposal is going to have to identify how much tax increment capture is needed over what time period from the various taxing entities to make the project pencil with those additional costs that come from additional density of development. So that would identify what those needs are. And then this independent gap analysis evaluates those calculations from the city. That gap analysis is completed, and the gap analysis then can go back to the city and say, hey, you aimed a little high, or what about this? And then the city can modify or not, but the city has the option to modify the proposal. Then the proposal goes to this HTRZ committee. a new one would be set up for each committee, each proposed HTRZ, and it's made up of members from the city, the county, schools, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, UTA, UDOT, the legislature, GOED, et cetera. All of these parties to come together and evaluate the proposal. And if it is approved then by that committee, if it satisfies the objectives of the statute, if the gap analysis, shows that this project will pencil, then the tax increment will be captured pursuant to that proposal. Furthermore, and final point that I'll note here is that an add-on to the HTRZ is that, of course, the presumption here is that you do more dense development and there's increased property taxes in the zone. There's also increased sales activity and therefore sales taxes paid. Well, what's the largest sales taxing entity in the state? Well, it's the state of Utah, of course, with the majority of the rate. Within the HTRZ, what will happen is 15% of the incremental growth in state sales tax above the base. So that incremental growth, 15% of it will be deposited into the TTIF, which is the Transportation Investment Fund. That's the state fund through UDOT that is available for transit projects. And that funding in that TTIF will be prioritized for transit projects within an HTRZ. So again, the point being all hands on deck to create more possibility of this development to occur that coordinates housing and transportation in the areas that it makes sense. Okay, Nick, now I'm going to turn to Nick. We can look at the questions that are coming in here, but Nick, I'm going to ask you, please talk about this HTRZ proposal or legislation or tool from the perspective of an actual city economic development and RDA director, please.
Sure. It's a really interesting and powerful tool, potentially with near the front runner stops, where maybe you haven't been able to get one, the mixed use environment, but secondly, the density of population and or residential that you've been hoping for. And in some cities, as Andrew indicated, this is optional, but in some cities, the reason is because there is a gap. Traditionally, it's either caused by the cost of the structured parking, or of late, it's the cost of materials, cost of construction. And so this can be a tool to help offset those so that whatever the objectives are of that community, and in particular, in their transit-oriented development areas, they can maybe get closer to their objectives. It's, again, only front runner. There is actually one exception to the overlap provision with CRAs, and that's if you have an inactive industrial site that currently has a CRA. So there's one little special option there. Another thing to remember is that 51% of the total area within the HTRZ would have to be residential. So mixed use, but they're asking for it to lean a little bit on the majority side to the residential, which is the purpose, right? And so, and not hamstringing a city into only residential or only a certain type of development. You have an opportunity for it to better fit your master plan objectives of your community. So I think as this bill over time gets utilized, uses and rulemaking gets expanded, I think it could become in the future a greater tool. I mean, I would hope that the state will be in a position to make more leveraging available. All of those things in the future could even make it more powerful for communities.
Nick, thanks a lot. There's a few questions in the chat. Let's take a shot at those, and then I know Wayne, you're going to want to move on here, so we can wrap up on the HTRZ here. So Ben asked, what property tax entities? Now I know not everybody's seeing this question, so I'm going to read it out loud here. What property tax entities, in addition to cities, counties, and school districts, can be compelled to participate through tax increment? So for example, does it include water districts, mosquito abatement districts? The answer is yes. All of the property taxing entities that have a levy would be participants in this HTRZ. And on that HTRZ committee that I discussed, the school districts are specifically represented, the counties are specifically represented, and there is a seat set aside in the committee for whichever the next largest taxing entity is at the local level. But the answer, Ben, is all of them. Then Rod asks, is the HTRZ committee decision a legislative or administrative one? That is it subjective or are there specific objective standards? Good question. The statute actually lays out the criteria by which the HTRZ committee has to make its determination. Now, I would say there's a degree of judgment involved in that, but it is a decision based on the criteria in the statute, in the bill. And then Mayor Dandoy, when will WFRC post these charts on their website for us to capture and download? And the answers, and Miranda's saying the league is going to send out the slides at the end of the webinar, and all of the information that we've given to you today about HB 433, about SB 217, it's all on our website under our public involvement and government affairs tab on our website. So great source of info. Nick, anything else on HTRZ or anybody else here?
Unless there's any questions,
Okay, terrific. My parting comment then is going to be this. As we continue to deal with the challenges of growth, what we know in Utah is that we have enviable quality of life and we cannot take it for granted. Being the fastest growing state in the nation over the past 10 years means that things are going to change and we have to be working together to address them. So much is happening in your communities. You are doing so much. You're at the front lines of dealing with these challenges on housing and transportation. This past legislative session was a very positive one in that regard, in that there was more investment for transportation and there are more tools available for you like HTRZs to help enable more growth to occur in the places that it makes sense, like around front runner stations. So we're here to help you as you sort through these tools and use them on your own volition. Better that we do it on our own rather than be dictated to as to exactly what types of a development should occur and where. That was the motivation behind the infrastructure investment coupled with the housing and transit reinvestment zones. Okay, thanks for the opportunity. And Nick, take it away.
Okay. Let me see if I can, well, you have to unshare and I'll share. Okay. I'm here to take a few minutes to talk about SB 65. This was under the CRA legislation that provided for a conversion of tax increment growth in a sunsetting project area to be used for economic development purposes. There was a lot of key reasons in this bill that we were trying to address. And some of it had to do with the taxing entities and concerns about the frequency of requests, sometimes about projects that didn't align with objectives of those taxing entities. And there was also a need, as CRAs have become more specialized and specific in terms of their applicability and implementation, an opportunity to address stable long-term funding of economic development, particularly for localized economic development projects. One of the things you'll see as I go through the materials is that oftentimes CRAs are created for large-scale, large CapEx kinds of projects, and yet sometimes there's a need for localized economic development, small business, and this was a tool that was created and looked at to help address that. A couple of key considerations to understand. First of all, this conversion is completely optional. An agency, a city, it's optional for them to create it. It's optional for a taxing entity to participate. It does not remove the ability to still do CRAs, but if you use this tool, you recognize that in the future, CRAs will be for those, as I mentioned, larger CapEx kind of regional significant kinds of projects. You have to follow an implementation plan as far as how you use these dollars as we go through the process of how that's done. It provides some greater agility. We talk about affordable housing. This could very easily be a fund that a city could use to help do affordable housing as a stable, ongoing source. As you know, in the past, there have been EDA project areas that provided a set aside, but they had a sunset. And when they sunsetted, that flow of affordable housing dollars also sunsetted. And so this is an opportunity here. It's still local governing of those dollars. Your city council / RDA board still controls those funds, how they're spent, what the objectives are. None of that changes. And one of the other things is that you will not seek to do, if you use this tool, RDA project areas for local opportunity, but you also will not seek for extension of existing project areas. One of the trade-offs in using this tool, because it's an ongoing tool. In the conversion process, as growth is converted to a tax rate, the intent is that the actual tax rate to the taxpayer stays neutral. So that conversion of growth is the only thing being converted to a tax rate, but not any kind of increase in the levy. So how do you do it? What's the process? First, you got to decide if it works for you. You got to decide if it's viable for your community or your agency to do. The second is part of that is to do an implementation plan. And I would recommend those be rather detailed and as to how those dollars will be used. And you may want to provide localized use of the funds. You may decide you want to use these citywide, but that's an inherent process that you can go through with your community and your agency. Once you've determined those, then the city or the county, depending on where the project area is sunsetting, would then go through a process of one, creating the agency as a taxing entity so that it can levy that tax rate. And then as part of that, you can also seek the participation of other taxing entities. Again, it's optional. They don't have to. And I wouldn't imagine very many would, but you may have a taxing entity who will see an opportunity partnering with an agency for specific economic development goals that they would like to make, or that are important to them and part of their objectives. And then there's the process of actually converting that growth into a tax rate. Now, this is a very complicated mathematical kind of process. And Benj Becker, Jason Birmingham, people of those can help you with exactly how that can be done. It is a complicated mathematical computation, but we have been able to do it. And we've been able to show for some cities, it works really well. In other cities, that conversion rate is just not as efficient. Again, that's why it's optional. And then those dollars that are converted, you must follow the implementation plan. It also requires you to do the same reporting as you do on CRA dollars now. It's still required to be shown in your November 1 report. You still make the same materials available to the tax commission and others. So it follows those same CRA processes. This is a little bit of just a graphic that kind of shows you how this happens. If you look at a traditional CRA project area, you hit that 20 years, it sunsets, all of that growth comes into the base. In the bottom here, we're saying that you take a portion of that growth and then you convert that, and it may not be all of it. It can be any percentage of it you want it to be into a tax rate that can then be captured and used localized economic development projects within your community. So I think the things to remember about the bill is that one, it's completely optional on both ends. It's optional to create, it's optional to participate. We know that it doesn't work for every community as well as it does for some. And it does not replace the current CRA statute. This is not a replacement. It still provides that same, you can still do CRA project areas, particularly for regional. So anyway, that's kind of in a nutshell how it works. It's really pretty straightforward. The complicated part is actually taking that growth and going through the process of converting it to a tax rate. To be honest, that is where the real kind of complicated part is. So happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Nick, looks like there's a few questions in the chat. The first one says, under SB 65, creating the RDA as a taxing entity, could the new entity be compelled to participate in the tax increment in an HTRZ? So he's trying to understand how these two new tools work together or against.
Oh, okay. So the Senate Bill 217 does not allow for an overlap of the two. So in both drafts, currently, you would have to go one way or the other. Now, it's a good question. If you converted one, Could that area be subject and be part of a TRZ? You know what? I don't know the actual answer to that, since the TRZ is a new, I haven't seen anything in that legislation that provides any specificity on this. Given, I guess because both bills went through the legislature at the same time, it's one of those things. But that's a good question. I think we probably have to seek the answer on that. But by and large, you can't overlap the two, a CRA and an HTRZ. You can't overlap them. Once the CRA sunsets and no longer exists, because one of the provisions in Senate Bill 65 is that you have to cancel the project area. You have to cease it. You have to go through the process of actually shutting it down. I would say because of that, and it's no longer a CRA, once it is sunsetted, yes, you would have the ability to do an HTRZ, because you are required under 65 to shut down the project area, and is no longer recognized as one. And Senate Bill 217 says you can't use this where there's an active CRA. So I would say that once it sunsets and you convert it, yes, you'd have that opportunity.
Thanks. So there's a question from Ken. I think you answered it already, but can this tool be used on an existing CDA project area, which is the previous statutory name for what we now know as a CRA?
Yes. So it would be any existing project area, EDA, URA, CDA. Once they sunset, you can't convert it until it sunsets. It's run its course. That question's come up to me a couple of different times. Is we have 10 years left in our CDA. Can we convert it now? No. Once it's run its course, you could. I guess the one exception to that would be you could cease the CDA. But I'll be honest with you, I don't know why you would do that, because you'd want to maximize the growth. So you'd be much better off running the CDA through its full term than doing the conversion, if it works for you.
One more question came in. Would the implementation plan be updated on a regular schedule? Are the updates required at a certain interval, or could it be amended easily?
That is completely up to the agency board, and it must follow what is the same language that currently exists in the CRA legislation when it comes to project area plans. So there is the ability to amend. It's up to the agency board to set those objectives and amend accordingly. So it doesn't remove, it doesn't change how that's handled. It's still handled the same way. It's just that you do have to have an implementation plan for the dollars.
So Cliff asked if there's a one-pager or so on SB 65. So the league, we will have a summary in our legislative wrap-up, and we will make these slides available after the presentation. All right. If there aren't any other questions, I want to thank Andrew and Miranda, Nick, and Benji for their participation today and for their ability to summarize these very complex bills into understandable information. I want to go ahead and welcome the Executive Director Cameron Deal on. He wants to touch on a few bills, and Cam and I can tag team on a few remaining bills that passed during the legislative session.
Perfect. Thank you, Wayne, and thank you everybody for your participation. Wayne, I'll let you hit the bills. Other than 348, I want to hit some high-level thoughts on 348, and any other panelists who want to jump in on 348, you're welcome to as well, because I think when we look back on this session and say which bill is going to have the biggest impact from a big picture perspective on economic opportunity and development, it'll be House Bill 348. So Wayne, I'll let you hit those other ones, and then I'll finish up.
Sure. So we just want to make you aware again of a couple bills that passed that impact what you can do in your communities. The first one is SB 214. It's an official language bill. Utah's official language is English, and the bill leaves that as English is the official language. But being able to produce documents or hold meetings in other languages, there were defined exceptions to that. All of those defined exceptions were removed. So it leaves English as the official language, but it now leaves it up to you as a city or town to be able to hold meetings or produce documents in other languages, or even signage within your parks in other languages as you see fit. So more flexibility in that arena. The other bill is SB 194. It's the Utah Main Street Opportunity Program. So this creates a new program within the Governor's Office of Economic Development, which again, it helps you identify and revitalize your Main Street or your economic centers within your communities. And the office will provide technical assistance in how to do that and potentially go after federal funding that is available to, again, revitalize your Main Street or your economic zones within your communities. So we're excited for that new program, and we'll have more information as the office stands that up.
Perfect. Thank you, Wayne. And House Bill, or excuse me, Senate Bill 194 had its genesis in a couple of communities, Brigham City and Price, in particular, where there was a successful pilot program that now is turning into legislation that should have dramatic and important impacts on communities across the state for the years to come. On that note, House Bill 348, I think, is going to end up being the game changer bill in how we look at economic development and opportunity in the state of Utah. Before I dive too deep into House Bill 348, I want to actually take a step back to work that Nick Dirksen and many other league members, including many people on this call, did with Carson Eilers and John Hiskey 2 summers ago. And that was work through the league resolution process to bring a resolution that the membership unanimously endorsed. I know, Nick, it seems like a decade ago, right? Because it was pre-pandemic. But a resolution that the league membership unanimously endorsed about community-focused economic development. And it highlighted key principles of how communities should invest in economic development and, more importantly, invest in themselves, invest in their residents, invest in infrastructure, and keep the focus on quality of life. Carson, you're always Johnny on the spot. I was trying to figure out if I wanted to ask for permission to share my screen and blow it all up. Thank you for just doing it that way. So you can see that resolution on the league website. The league, in conjunction with Wasatch Front Regional Council, has also endorsed resolutions about transportation investment and infrastructure, and Andrew's team already talked about that. So my point is, these conversations have been happening at city halls around the state around transportation, infrastructure, and economic development. Well, what we've seen since the election of Governor Spencer Cox is a refocus on what we want to accomplish with Utah's economic engine. We are the envy of the country. There's no doubt about that. When you look at almost any economic indicator, every other state wants to be Utah. But Governor Cox, first on the campaign trail and now as governor, has said we need to take a holistic approach at economic development. And at the same time, we're looking holistically at the entire state and not just growing for the sake of growing. We also need to come back and focus on the individual, focus on residents who are already here, focus on businesses that are already here but are looking to grow. So how do we take this holistic approach and then recognize that whatever we do as a state to incentivize a certain outcome is going to have other consequences on the community, whether that's air quality, whether that's the job creation, whether that's impact on housing supply or schools. Again, taking this holistic approach to economic development. That was really the genesis for House Bill 348. And it's exciting for us from a league perspective to look at our resolution that you endorsed a couple of years ago and see those principles being put into action with House Bill 348. So it's probably come up on the call already, but GoEd is no more. May it rest in peace. GoEd is now Go Utah. And that is an important change. It's one word, but it's significant. No longer will it be the Governor's Office of Economic Development. Instead, it will be the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity. And that opportunity is really vital to have this conversation about economic development for the individual, economic opportunities for the individual, for businesses that are already here, and that holistic approach of how we recruit businesses, how we grow businesses, and what the impacts are of economic growth across the state and not just in one region. As part of this, there's going to be set up in the next few weeks the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission, the UEOC. I'm sure we'll come up with some sort of snazzy title for that for shorthand, but for now it is the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission. I'm just going to call it the commission. So this commission will stand up. It'll have representation from across the economic world, including a representative speaking on behalf of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. We will be accepting applications, opening up our application process in the next couple of weeks as we look to fill that person. And the league's appointment in statute is responsible to speak for urban interests. The Utah Association of Counties also has a spot. They are tasked in statute to speak for rural interests. Now, being a statewide organization, both the league and UAC, we will want to hear the perspectives of all of our members, but specifically in statute, our representative on this commission will speak for urban issues. We want to make sure that whoever that individual is has behind her or behind him the key voices of Utah cities around the state, and so that they can provide that input to that overall commission. So again, stay tuned when we open up that application process and we figure out how we're going to stand that up internally as well as externally. So that's House Bill 348. It does a lot of other things as it retools GOED and changes the incentive structure and really sets the foundation for these conversations. I keep using the word holistically. The other word I'm going to use is alignment. We've heard this a lot from state legislators that they want to see alignment between what the state is trying to accomplish and incentivize, what local governments are trying to incentivize, and make sure that there's that communication and alignment of those overall interests. And so we expect that. And I think this will be another forum to have the conversation about infrastructure and transportation, broadband, water, affordable housing, housing affordability, because all of these pieces come together and economic opportunity is really at the center of it. So stay tuned. I think this is going to be a great forum in the years to come, but it's House Bill 348 if you want to take a deeper dive on that bill. With that, I'm looking in the chat, and Andrew, thank you for putting the summary there. Is there anything anybody else wants to add about 348 or any other bills? Mr. Gruber.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I'd love to make a comment about the Economic Opportunity Commission and what's going on here. And I'll use your term, holistic alignment. I like it, Cameron. That's what the bill is aimed at. I think just to build on what Cameron said, this bill is recognizing a real transition in the way we think about economic opportunity and the way that we think about growth. There has been historically a real effort in Utah that's been extremely successful of creating new jobs. A lot of that through tax incentives that has not been as focused on what those jobs should be, where they're located. And so this holistic nature that Cameron is talking about, the charge of this new commission is incredibly broad, and it recognizes that the nature of our economy and how well our economy does for all of our communities and all of our residents is not just about straight up job creation, right? It impacts and is impacted by our infrastructure, our water, our job training. I mean, there's so many aspects at play in what translates into whether we as a whole have a thriving economy and whether all the members of our community have access to that economic opportunity. And so it's ambitious, and I think it's the kind of thing that's going to put Utah in a good position. The thing for us to watch out for as local governments is, can there be a better coordination between the state activities and the local activities, development decisions on the ground, and what are the relative roles of all of the parties? The aspiration of this is that coordination to get everybody working in the same direction. It's going to take a lot of effort and focus, though, and partnership to bring it to fruition in a way that works for everybody.
Well, thank you, Cam, and thank you, Andrew. And again, thank you to everyone on our panel today. I think this has been a great conversation and very informative. We would like to invite everyone to participate in next Wednesday's Wednesday webinar, which will be April 7th from noon to 1. And we will be going over election law updates. We will have Shelley Jackson, the Deputy Director from the Office of the Lieutenant Governor, and we'll be touching on ranked choice voting, OPMA, and GRAMA, and some other interim updates. So again, thank you for everyone's participation today, and have a great day.
Everybody,
Thanks all.
see you next month.